The streets of the Principality host this weekend's World Championship round, a unique and very atypical Grand Prix, given the track's characteristics and the car setup demands. With ultra-soft tires and complex race strategies to consider, the Monaco round was expected to be a damage-limiting exercise for the Maranello team. Until Imola, Ferrari had struggled in slow corners, but in Monaco, it has shown good potential, a result of the absence of compromise. Monaco often brings surprises. This is what Charles Leclerc said 2 days ago. On the eve of his home race, the Ferrari driver hadn't hidden a certain concern over how the SF25 would perform in the slow corners that characterized the Monaco circuit, though he had left the door open to a glimmer of hope. One swallow doesn't make a summer, and it is clearly too early to draw conclusions from a weekend that still has much to reveal. Nevertheless, the first day of free practice did indeed deliver surprises, starting with a Ferrari more effective than expected. This competitiveness also stems from the very elements that, paradoxically, had held it back until now. Compared to other events, such as the recent Miami GP, Monte Carlo doesn't require such extreme compromises and allows the team to move in a single setup direction. Slow tracks like Singapore, filled with similar 90-degree corners, or Monte Carlo, allow for fewer aerodynamic compromises, with setups leaning toward high downforce wings and softer suspension to absorb bumps and attack the curbs. Although certain traits in the car's DNA remain unchanged, the SF25 has so far proven to be too stiff in its effort to maintain a stable platform. Being able to run with softer setups has helped find a greater margin of adaptability than on other circuits. Moreover, running on a bumpy street circuit forces everyone, not just Ferrari, to raise the ride height. However, the main point is another. The drivers felt at ease with the car on the Principality's streets. Both Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton highlighted the good feeling, something rarely seen this season, when more extreme setups led to a nervous car forced into compromises to extract its potential. If the possibility of making fewer compromises helped hide some weaknesses of the car, that does not mean the SF25 has changed its nature. In free practice, it posted competitive times exactly where expected, in the medium-high speed sections, while still struggling in the slow ones, where the MCL39 single-seater remains the benchmark. This is clearly noticeable at Tabak and in the swimming pool section, one of the few places where cars were seen scraping the asphalt. But that margin isn't replicated across all medium-speed sections, such as Massenet and Casino, perhaps because those require more front-end work to rotate the car, an area where the SF25 tends to reveal some of its limits. Another element pushing Ferrari to the top was its speed on the straights, with an advantage not solely due to traction or wings, but also to engine mappings. While it is true that, generally, Ferrari is more efficient than its rivals, in Monaco McLaren showed up with a rear wing that wasn't full high downforce, but an intermediate solution, similar to what was used last year in Zandvoort. Since there is only one DRS zone on the main straight, it is not even a matter of open wing effectiveness, but purely efficiency and mappings. Ferrari seems to have pushed a bit more, gaining about 1/10 and a half on the straights. Adding up this straight-line advantage, the competitiveness in the first braking zone, and especially the ability to stay close to McLaren through Massenet, it becomes clearer where that 10th gained in Sector 1 came from. The difficulties begin where McLaren, by contrast, excels. The lower the speed, the more the MCL39's mechanical qualities emerge. It's no coincidence that in Turn 5, Mirabeau, and the hairpin, the gap starts to widen in favor of the papaya-colored car. But the most interesting insight comes around Turn 7 and 8. Turn 7 is one of those spots where drivers try to cut the inside curb to shorten the route and limit understeer. While the McLaren drivers can be aggressive, the Ferrari drivers opted to avoid clearly cutting the curb, confirming there are still limitations. One of the MCL39's great strengths is indeed its relatively soft setup compared to rivals, which proves effective especially over curbs and in slow sections, without sacrificing too much in the faster ones. This trait, combined with its high downforce, gives it good versatility. But in free practice, several mistakes were seen, and the drivers themselves admitted they hadn't put together clean laps. Realistically, McLaren remains the silent frontrunner, but it will need something that's often been missing this season, the ability to put it all together. Because over a single lap, Charles Leclerc doesn't hold back, especially on home soil. Furthermore, it is likely the straight-line delta will shrink in qualifying, which should bring them closer. Speaking of rivals, Red Bull endured an underwhelming FP2, partly due to setup choices that turned out to be wrong, causing excessive understeer. On a track like Monaco, where front-end confidence is crucial, Max Verstappen paid the price for this, especially in the slower sections. In essence, the problems were similar to Ferrari's but even more pronounced and without the usual straight-line advantage. Pending a power unit ramp-up on Saturday, it will be a topic to follow closely today, hoping for the usual overnight miracle, now a staple of their trackside operations. Further behind was Mercedes, which, after the issues at Imola, chose to take a step back from some of the solutions introduced last weekend in Italy, starting with the new rear suspension, which was shelved in favor of the previous spec. In their case, the gap increases more linearly throughout the lap, with the most significant losses in the medium-speed sections. There's setup work to be done. Until last year, the Maranello team's car was unbeatable in terms of traction, thanks to a rear suspension with the right amount of vertical travel. This allowed the SF24 to enter a squat phase and put down both thermal and electrical power from the 0667 engine. In 2025, this trait was visible in Melbourne, but then disappeared as the team pursued that infamous compromise. Indeed, it was discovered that the vertical force acting on the suspension exceeded what was necessary to manage plank wear. This posed a major issue, forcing Ferrari to run the SF25 outside of its optimal window, higher and stiffer at the rear. A compromise that undermined one of the gains achieved with the new front-end geometry. By limiting the rear suspension travel, the front was also compromised in terms of contact patch, since there was minimal load transfer. As a result, the strong front end that Maranello had extracted from the SF25 was no longer performing. Back to traction. The difference with Oscar Piastri is minimal, but it still helps highlight Ferrari's strengths. In the comparison with McLaren's Australian driver, the differences are small, noticeable in Turn 1 and through the casino section. Charles Leclerc can keep the throttle slightly more open, with around 10–15% more than Oscar Piastri. This shows how the setup can put Ferrari's power unit performance down onto the tarmac along with the rear tires. Something is still missing at the front, where Piastri achieves better cornering between turns 5 and 7. Another positive note is Lewis Hamilton's gradual approach to Friday's sessions. He lagged in FP1 but was just over a tenth behind in FP2. The 7-time world champion took a different approach from everyone else, testing various setups to unlock the much-talked-about potential of the SF25. Even though it's a very different car from those he's driven in the past, Hamilton appears to be gaining confidence with the SF25. In the comparison with Charles Leclerc and Oscar Piastri, his approach to the casino corner is impressive. The SF25 seems to generate a lot of downforce, allowing him to attack the corners without ever fully closing the throttle. An overly aggressive approach at Upper Mirabeau slightly compromised his run through the hairpin. The mechanical grip unlocked from this SF25 appears extremely high, thanks to a setup compromise that simply doesn't exist here in Monaco. The absence of high-speed corners allowed Ferrari to soften the rear axle springs, enabling greater suspension travel. This positively impacts acceleration and exit from slow corners, but is clearly detrimental at higher speeds, where a compliant rear end prevents high-speed stability. This behavior will be addressed in Maranello with an updated rear suspension, likely arriving at Silverstone.